This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning is Scot Bertram, a Bennett grad, a White Sox fan, a former morning guy in Illinois, in Rockford, and now he's the general manager of WRFH Radio Free Hillsdale, where we are broadcasting today at Hillsdale College, the Mesopotamia of American higher education. And Scott, we were talking about guns before, and you mentioned Charles Cook at National Review. Mm-hmm. He had his views largely informed by being a Brit about guns in America, and then he did the research, and those views changed a bit. And I always go back to this piece that was very underreported for all kinds of obvious reasons by Leah Labrisco in the Washington Post. This is back in October of last year. She is a researcher for 538 blog. Mm-hmm. She writes, "Before I started researching gun deaths, gun control policy used to frustrate me. I wish the NRA would stop blocking common sense gun control reforms, such as banning assault weapons, restricting silencers, shrinking magazine sizes, and all the other measures that could make guns less deadly. Then my colleagues and I at 538 spent 3 months analyzing all 33,000 lives ended by guns each year in the United States, and I wound up frustrated in a whole new way. We looked at what interventions might have saved those people, and the case for the policies I'd lobbied for crumbled when I examined the evidence. The best ideas left standing were narrowly tailored interventions to protect subtypes of potential victims, not broad attempts to limit the lethality of guns." A jarring statement. You would think it would have generated more attention than it did, especially since it's based on empirical research.
Right.
She went on to talk about the distribution of gun deaths. 2/3 of the gun deaths in the United States are from suicides. Almost no proposed restriction would make it meaningfully hard for people with guns on hand to use them. I couldn't even answer my own my most desperate question, she writes. If I had a friend who had guns in his home and a history of suicide attempts, was there anything I could do that would help? And then the next largest set of gun deaths, 1 in 5 young men aged 15 to 34 killed in homicides, most likely to die at the hands of other young men, often related to gang loyalties or other street violence, and so on. So all of the bromides and refrigerator magnet phraseology you heard over the weekend in D.C. has no relevance to dealing with the 33,000 gun deaths in America each year, and this is the research of somebody who came to the table predisposed to be marching in D.C. on Saturday.
When you look at the fact, John Lott was on with us earlier, so many of the prescribed solutions simply wouldn't have changed any of the consequences, the outcomes of the shootings that people most want to stop.
And my suspicion is that a lot of people who are advocates for those policies know that, mm-hmm. and there's an ulterior motive. Now, some don't, and that means we got to do a little gunsplaining. And to help us with gunsplaining, per his piece in National Review, is our friend David French, who is a writer at National Review, of course, constitutional lawyer, best-selling author, and also a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. David, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, gunsplaining, when gun aficionados, gun enthusiasts come over the top with detailed idiosyncratic knowledge of guns to those who are inclined to believe, as Leah Labrisco did back in the day, that banning guns or restricting their use or limiting the number that you can buy and so on and so forth is the right way to go. Well, you distilled the gunsplaining for us gunsplainers.
Yeah, I used the term because it was adopted by a writer in the Washington Post who used it pejoratively to kind of to take on gun owners who sometimes roll their eyes at mistakes that they hear on television or dismiss gun control, critics of gun rights when they make mistakes. And now, look, there are a few times when gun rights advocates are too consumed with technical jargon and can kind of overwhelm people with technical jargon. But the reality is people who don't know anything about guns, don't know anything about gun crime, don't know anything about the effect of gun policy, don't know anything about self-defense, are telling Americans who have knowledge in all of those areas what's best for them. And the problem that you have is gunsplaining in that circumstance becomes an absolute necessity. So, for example, what you just went through with the Leo Labresco information, which is a piece that should have been shared all across the United States, when you hear the words assault weapons ban or large capacity magazine ban, what you have to understand is an assault weapons ban will not do one thing for suicides, which is most gun deaths in the United States. It will not do one thing to stop the kind of gun deaths that are the most common in the United States, which are the kinds of gun violence that's most common. You know, the gun homicides that are gang related or domestic violence related. It won't stop mass shootings because it's not like people are sitting there, mass shooters are going, well, if I can't shoot with an AR-15, I won't shoot at all. So it won't stop mass shootings. So what will it do? What will it do? What it will do is deprive some percentage of Americans of their weapon of choice for home defense. That's what it will do. But what it won't do is address any of the problems that we have of gun violence in the United States. And so, you know, when you try to break it down and describe things like that, often then what happens is people will lapse back into, well, I just don't think weapons of war should be on American streets, right, which is an impulse, not a policy decision.
David Scot Bertram, from your piece, you write, one gets the impression that all too many members of the media and all too many activists don't want to know anything more about guns. They've made the decision they need to make. Guns are bad. The rest is a distraction. The first half of that is especially troubling because, hey, if activists have a position, all right, but media members should be there to point out the facts, to ask these questions. And that's something we've seen scarce little of in the dealings with some of these students who are now involved in the gun control debate.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And, you know, the interesting thing is the invention of this whole term, gunsplaining, to kind of dismiss gun rights advocates when they try to educate the public, I think is going to make people feel even more self-righteous about their ignorance. So, you know, what you're going to have now is a pattern that, like where a person says, you know, actually, I don't think weapons of war should be allowed on American streets. And someone responds and says, well, you know, an AR-15 is not what our soldiers carry in combat. And then the immediate response is, well, don't gunsplain to me, you know. And so what you're going to have is a more invincible form of ignorance, because they're then going to reflexively start to stigmatize the act of explaining the truth. And, you know, these are important. This is critically important. I mean, what we're dealing with right now is the most of the quote-unquote common sense gun control restrictions that are talked about, the vast majority of them are restrictions that we know for a fact are not going to have a meaningful effect at all on the people who actually kill other people. But we do know they'll have an effect on law-abiding citizens. And that strikes me as exactly the wrong kind of reform. Why would you rationally enact reforms that have the negative effect is concentrated on the law-abiding when it's irrelevant to the criminal class, which are the group of people who actually commit the crime? And yet you say that again and again and again, and the retort is, again, I'll go right back to it. There's this impulse. Well, you just don't need that weapon for self-defense. Yet the person's already demonstrated their profound ignorance about guns. Why on earth should I listen to anything they say about what I need or don't need for self-defense, as opposed to actual experts who know the topic, who tell me things completely different from these people?
Well, and also, too, the failure of institutions, right, as kind of all the civic institutions that form the bedrock of a free society continue to fail and fail spectacularly. It suggests even more need to be prepared to be ultimately held responsible for your own defense, whether you want to be or not. And I'm not just talking about the Broward County Sheriff's Office or the FBI in the Parkland school shooting case. Also, today or yesterday, we find out that the Orlando shooter's father was allegedly a longtime FBI informant. and his relationship with the FBI as an informant may have influenced the FBI to not pursue his son as he was plotting to do the horrible thing that he did. When you see FBI and law enforcement, I again, the caveat, generally speaking, they're good people who do a good job. I get all that, concede the point. But when you see spectacular failures and terrible judgment calls, boy, it certainly says, as a backstop, I better be prepared to cover my own ass.
Yeah. Look, let's just presume for a minute let's presume facts not in evidence and say that the FBI is the most competent law enforcement agency in the world. Let's just presume that it is. If that is the case, it will still win some and lose some. It will still get some criminals and some will fall through the cracks, even if it is the best in the world. And so there will then be those who fall through the cracks. What do you do in that circumstance? Do you have another line of defense? I would say rational people would have another line of defense. But right now, there's available evidence that indicates that, maybe the FBI isn't the best law enforcement agency in the world. Or if it is, it's only because other law enforcement agencies are really suffering worse than the FBI. And when you see the level of failures that we saw from the Broward County Sheriff, that we've seen from the FBI, that we've seen in the background check system in the Virginia Tech shooting, in the Sutherland Springs shooting, in the Charleston shooting, when you see all of those failures and you say, yeah, then the argument against having a line of defense, an effective line of defense in your own home or in your business or in your school, I think becomes almost comically wrong to say that you can't do that. Well, I wouldn't say comically wrong. I'd say tragically wrong to say that you can't do that. The other day I was riding with somebody on the way to a TV studio, and he was lamenting that common sense gun control and assault weapons ban and bans on large capacity magazines hadn't been implemented yet. And I said, let me ask you this. Let's suppose the worst happened and you and I were in a room and a man came in shooting. Would you be happy or sad if you knew that I had with me a Ruger with a 17-round a Ruger handgun with a 17-round magazine? I bet that moment when you discovered you had a chance would be a moment of intense hope and relief, not anger that I was carrying a gun. And he said, well, yeah, but I just really wish the guy attacked against didn't have a gun.
And, right. I could just wish it away. Yeah.
Yeah.
David, the argument that David Hogg presented and others, of course, is Marco Rubio and others are bought and paid for. They're voting the way they are because of the money they get from the NRA. We know that money overall is such a small percentage of the money involved in politics. And my ridiculously stupid question, of course, would be, if that's the case, why doesn't Michael Bloomberg step forward and get together with Hollywood friends and simply offer these lawmakers more than they're getting from the NRA? That seems like a logical conclusion. But this argument that they are, again, quote unquote, bought and paid for, there's a dollar amount that Marco Rubio has placed on the lives of children. How toxic is that argument? Is it making this debate more poisonous, less civil?
Oh, it's incredibly toxic. I mean, essentially, what you're doing is you're slandering the character of your opponents. And one of the first things that happens when I hear someone make an argument like that, say that they're bought and paid for, the first thing is I don't take them seriously as a participant in the discussion, because anybody who knows anything about the gun rights debate knows that the NRA is effective only if it effectively advances the views of its millions of members and the millions of gun-owning allies of the NRA. If the NRA does not effectively advance their views, they'll go elsewhere. I mean, you could eliminate the NRA tomorrow, and somebody would start something called the American Rifle Association, and they would flock to it as so long as it effectively advanced their views. That's why it's effective. You know, the interesting, one of the more interesting analyses I saw is that the NRA's use of its money is effective not because of its amount, but because of its signaling. It says, this is the NRA's stamp of approval on somebody, and that tells the millions of people who follow the NRA that this guy is good on this issue. So the NRA, so they don't know anything. The NRA reflects the will of millions and millions of people. And then the second thing it says is that you're dealing with somebody who's malicious. You're dealing with somebody who is waging culture war, not a policy debate. And a lot of this, we've got to be honest about this, a lot of this gun debate is culture war. Most of it, I'd say, is culture war. It's saying you people are bad and we're good. And it's trying to stigmatize away gun ownership as opposed to reason to proper gun policy.
He is David French from National Review, constitutional lawyer, best-selling author, veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. His latest piece you want to check out at nationalreview.com is In Defense of Gunsplaining. David French, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And he joined us on the turnkey.pro answer line.